In the black hours over the Bay of Biscay, a B-24 Liberator could carry depth charges, 10 tired men, and enough fuel to cross an ocean. But the part that frightened U-boat crews was not the bomb load. It was a sealed piece of microwave hardware tucked inside the nose, small enough to look like an afterthought, delicate enough that old-school engineers doubted combat crews could keep it alive, and powerful enough to change the Atlantic. Because this war was not decided by who could see a submarine first. Older radar could already do that. The real problem was crueler. A bomber could find a U-boat miles away, line up the attack, descend over black water, and then, right when the crew needed the target most, the submarine disappeared from the screen. Not because it had escaped, because the radar had gone blind at close range. That was the gap German captains lived inside. The last mile, the last half mile, the final 30 seconds. And the machine that broke them was not a bigger bomber, a larger bomb, or a better gun. It was a shorter wave. By 1941, RAF Coastal Command already had airborne radar. The main set in service, ASV Mark II, worked on a wavelength of about 1.7 meters. It had solid range. It could detect a surfaced submarine from miles away. On a planning map, that sounded like the answer. But war does not happen on a planning map. Long-wave radar could point a crew toward a contact at distance, but its beam was broad, its antenna system was awkward, and its close-range picture degraded when the aircraft was already committed to the attack. For a U-boat, that was enough. A surfaced submarine did not need to outrun a bomber. It only had to crash dive before the weapons arrived. 30 seconds could save the boat. 20 seconds could save the crew. And the older radar gave those seconds away. Air crews knew the failure in the most practical way possible. The scope would show a return. The navigator would call the bearing. The pilot would bring the bomber down. The sea would fill the windshield. Then, at the exact moment the target should have become unavoidable, the picture would dissolve into clutter. From that point on, the attack was no longer mathematics. It was memory, timing, guesswork, and luck. A captain who began his dive at the right moment could vanish under the depth charges before they arrived. That was why the first war against U-boats from the air looked so frustrating. Patrol aircraft were not blind over the ocean. They were blind at the point of decision. The problem was not finding the enemy. It was finishing the attack. The solution began in Britain, inside the kind of laboratory that almost never looks dramatic from the outside. At Oxford's Clarendon Laboratory, researchers worked with a device that radio engineers had been circling for years, the cavity magnetron. It could generate microwaves with far more useful power than the old assumptions said should be possible. Instead of a wave measured in meters, this system could work around 10 centimeters, less than 4 inches. That change sounds small only if you forget what wavelength controls. Shorten the wave, and the antenna can shrink. Shorten the wave, and the beam can tighten. Shorten the wave, and a radar return stops being a vague smear and starts becoming a sharp enough picture to hold a conning tower close in. That was the hidden mechanism. The breakthrough was not simply that the new radar reached farther. Range was the easy story. The real story was resolution. A 10-centimeter beam could live in an aircraft nose instead of sprawling across the fuselage. It could sweep the black water ahead of the bomber. It could keep the target separated from the sea long after the old set had begun to fail. And to a U-boat running on the surface at night, that meant the old escape pattern was breaking. Not slowly, all at once. But a magnetron in a lab did not win the Atlantic. A hand-built device could impress scientists and still fail the war. It had to survive vibration, cold, salt air, bad maintenance, tired crews, field replacement, Production tolerances. A cracked part on a coastal airfield could not become a 6-week research problem. That was where the story crossed the ocean. Britain had the physics. The United States had the industrial machine to turn that physics into repeatable hardware. The same magnetron that looked almost too specialized for mass production became the heart of centimetric airborne radar, known to the British as ASV Mark III, and to American aviators through SCR series equipment. Factories did what battle needed them to do. They made the impossible boring. Rack after rack, set after set, nose installation after nose installation. That is the unglamorous part of the miracle. The weapon was not only a clever tube, it was a supply chain. It was a training pipeline. It was a bomber modification schedule. It was a replacement part that could reach a squadron before the next patrol. And once that happened, the U-boats were no longer facing a prototype. They were facing production. Still, even centimetric radar did not solve everything. That is the part that gets missed when the story is reduced to one magic gadget. A sharper radar could keep a cleaner picture closer to the submarine, but an attacking aircraft still had to release weapons at the right moment. The last few seconds remained brutal. Low altitude, Black Sea, spray on the windscreen. A submarine turning or diving. The aircraft closing so fast that one bad estimate could throw the entire depth charge pattern behind the boat. Radar had reduced the blind zone. It had not made human eyes useless. Then an RAF officer named Humphrey DeVerd Lee listened to the crews who were actually flying the missions. They did not need another conference paper. They needed to see the submarine at the end of the run. So Lee built the missing piece. A powerful searchlight mounted under the aircraft, aimed forward, kept dark until the final seconds. Not used for searching, not waved across the ocean like a lighthouse. Held off, saved. Then switched on only when the bomber was already close enough to attack. A 24-inch carbon arc light erupted into the night with roughly 22 million candela. For the U-boat crew, there was almost no warning. One moment, black water. The next, the submarine was caught in a white cone of light with an aircraft already above it. The Germans called it Das verdammte Licht, the damned light. And they were right to hate it, because radar got the bomber to the target. Centimetric resolution kept the target from dissolving too early. The Leigh Light turned the final seconds from guesswork into a visible attack. Each system covered the wound left by the one before it. Long range, close resolution, final visual lock. Break any link in that chain, and a submarine could slip through. Put them together, and the old U-boat routine stopped working. The numbers made the change impossible to dismiss. Through all of 1941, Coastal Command sank only one U-boat in the Bay of Biscay. One. After months of patrols, training, fuel, crews, and dangerous flying, the results still looked almost absurdly small. But once radar-directed night attacks and the Leigh Light matured, the pressure changed so sharply that German crews altered their behavior. Some stopped trusting the darkness. Some began surfacing by day instead, because at least in daylight, they could see the aircraft coming and fight back. Think about what that means. A searchlight and a radar set forced submariners to give up the night. Not because the ocean changed, because the Allies had removed the last hiding place in the attack. The darkness itself had become unsafe. Germany understood the danger quickly. They built METOX, a radar warning receiver meant to detect the older Allied airborne radar. For a time, it gave U-boat crews back the one thing they needed most: warning. If a captain knew radar was sweeping him, he could dive before the bomber arrived. The contest became a war over invisible signals. A few seconds of warning could mean survival. A missed frequency could mean death. Then centimetric radar shifted the fight again. The new microwave sets were outside what METOX could hear. Allied aircraft could approach without triggering the warning receiver U-boat crews had come to trust. Germany eventually fielded new receivers, including Naxos, but the pace of the contest had turned against them. By the time the countermeasure appeared in useful numbers, the U-boat force had already taken damage it could not casually replace. That is how you know the radar mattered. Not because one side praised it after the war, because both sides burned engineering time in the middle of the war trying to control the invisible air above the Bay of Biscay. The aircraft mattered too. A perfect radar set on an aircraft that could not reach the convoy routes was still a local tool. The Atlantic needed range. That was where the Liberator became decisive. The B-24 was not the most loved bomber in Allied service. It was large, awkward, and in early British opinion, not the ideal machine for European bombing. But over the ocean, one trait outweighed almost everything else. It could fly far. Very long-range Liberators carried extra fuel, often at the cost of armor and sometimes defensive armament. On paper, that looked reckless. A stripped bomber over hostile water sounded like a compromise stacked on top of a compromise. But the trade bought something no theory could replace: time over the gap. For convoy crews crossing the mid-Atlantic, the problem was not just whether aircraft existed. It was whether aircraft could stay with them, where U-boats had been waiting beyond normal patrol reach. For months, modified Liberators from units like No. 120 Squadron were among the only aircraft with the legs to cover that emptiness, that made the ugly bomber beautiful in the only way that mattered. It arrived where the submarines were, and it stayed long enough to matter. Inside that aircraft, the fight was never clean. A radar operator was reading a ghostly return on a vibrating screen. A pilot was holding a low approach over a moving sea. A bombardier was judging release in seconds. The crew had to manage altitude, bearing, light, weapons, weather, and fear while a submarine crew below them might be reaching for the dive controls or for the anti-aircraft guns. Later in the campaign, some U-boats chose to remain surfaced and fight. They added more weapons. They tried to turn the bomber into the hunted. That changed the final run again. Now the aircraft was not only racing a crash dive, it was flying into gunfire. So the equipment had to be more than clever. It had to keep working when the airframe shook, when tubes drifted, when salt corroded contacts, when cold made hands clumsy, when a crew that had already flown for hours suddenly had half a minute to do everything right. That is why field feedback mattered. The winning system was not a clean invention, dropped from a laboratory onto a battlefield. It was a rough chain of fixes hardened by the men using it over water at night. The crews found the failure. The engineers reduced it. Lee bridged it. Industry multiplied it. Commanders put it on aircraft with the range to make it count. That chain is the real weapon. Not radar alone. Not the light alone. Not the Liberator alone. The system. By the time the Atlantic air gap finally closed, the arithmetic had changed. Liberators were credited in full, or in part, with the destruction of 93 U-boats during the war. That is a staggering result for an aircraft that had once looked like a misfit in the British bomber force. But the reason was not mysterious. It carried the right equipment to the right place for long enough to expose the enemy's habit. German submarines had depended on surfacing. They needed air. They needed batteries charged. They needed movement. They needed the night. The Allied system attacked that routine, not just the hull. It made the surface dangerous. Then it made the darkness dangerous. Then it made the warning receiver unreliable. And once a submarine could no longer trust the old rhythm of the ocean, its freedom began to collapse. The critics had not been stupid. That is the uncomfortable part. Centimetric radar really was hard to build. The magnetron really did demand precision. Aircraft installations really were delicate. Removing armor for fuel really did increase risk. A searchlight under a bomber really did sound like a strange solution to a radar problem. The critics were often right about each individual weakness. They were wrong about the whole, because they judged parts one by one, while the war was being fought by systems. A fragile tube was not fragile if the supply chain could replace it. A stripped Liberator was not merely vulnerable if it could patrol the one stretch of ocean no other aircraft could reach. A searchlight was not primitive if it solved the exact second where electronics still failed. And a shorter wavelength was not an engineering luxury if it stole from the U-boat the only seconds it needed to live. The Battle of the Atlantic did not turn because someone built the cleanest machine on paper. It turned because engineers, factories, officers, and air crews built backward from the ugliest moment of the mission. The moment when the sea was black, the aircraft was low, the submarine was diving, the screen was failing, and 30 seconds decided whether a convoy route stayed open or another ship burned. That was the lesson hidden inside the nose of the Liberator. Do not design for the horizon. Design for the last 30 seconds.